MMT, or modern monetary theory, it emerged in part from the writings of Warren Mosler in his book, 7 Deadly Frauds of Economic Policy. It's a model of the economy that relies on precise definitions of financial assets, such as U.S. Treasuries, and it also incorporates national accounting identities, such as GDP. Recently, I spoke with Mr. Mosler about the importance of these identities within the MMT framework. Here's what he said.
Bank loans create bank deposits to the penny. So if you borrow $200,000 to buy a house, you take out a loan for $200,000, the bank gives a $200,000 to whoever sold the house. The bank now has a $200,000 loan, and there's been a $200,000 deposit that didn't exist before. And it's a bank liability, and we tend to call that money. Under certain definitions of money, that would be considered money. So what you had was bank loans made in dollars, create bank deposits in dollars, but there are no net financial assets created there. Loans are something somebody owes, and the deposit's something somebody has. They kind of cancel each other out. They net to zero.
I'm sorry?
Yeah.
So from the MMT perspective, or the Mosler economics perspective, what is the solution to the current crisis that we have in this country in terms of unemployment, et cetera?
Yeah. Okay, well, look, unemployment is always the evidence that the government has not spent enough to cover the tax bill and the residual savings desires, for lack of a better word. Okay, or in other words, if the government doesn't spend enough to cover the need to pay taxes and the desire to save, the evidence is unemployment, people looking for paid work and who can't find it.
So let me ask you, so we're not spending enough right now, and your prescription would be to spend more money to cure this unemployment problem.
Well, what I'm saying is the deficit's too low. So you could either cut taxes or increase spending.
Well, the government spending, is that necessarily productive spending, or is it just consumptive spending? Because it seems the government could just build Potemkin villages the way China is, and yes, it would put people to work, but would that really solve problems?
Okay, so no question about it. What you're saying is absolutely correct. The government could spend money to build the Panama Canal and improve terms of trade and costs and, and world prosperity, or it could spend money and blow up the Panama Canal, which would destroy world trade, right? So we're talking about two different things. One is the problem of unemployment, which is people looking for paid work who can't find it. Just because you've solved that problem and now there's paid work for everyone doesn't mean you have anything near an optimal solution of how to allocate your real resources, which is to your point.
What is the MMT definition of government itself? I believe that's I've looked into it, and could you explain that for our viewers?
In our case, I guess I've never specifically defined that.
Does it include the Federal Reserve, for instance?
Yeah, well, yeah, the Federal Reserve and the Treasury are both agents of Congress.
Okay, and let me ask you, there are primary dealers who transact with the Treasury directly, and they also transact with the Fed. Would you go so far as to say that these big banks and brokers like JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs are part of the government, given their roles in purchasing government debt?
I would say as banks, they are agents of government, even without that particular role. Okay, because they have government charters. All their liabilities are insured directly or indirectly, and they're operating under a strict regulatory environment where all their assets are regulated, and they're public, much like the military is. And much like the military, they have rules of engagement where the soldier can point his rifle wherever he wants, but at the same time, he's still, a government agent. And so bankers have the ability to price risk in order to make a return for private investors, but they have fairly narrow rules of engagement, and they're operating under strict regulation and supervision. So they're,
I'm sorry.
I consider them public sector entities.
Okay, and let's extend that a little bit. A lot of corporations like GE, Lockheed Martin derive a significant part of their income from government contracts. So would it be, could we extend this definition of government to include maybe Fortune 50, Fortune 100, Fortune 500 companies as well?
You could. You can define anything the way you want. Personally, I would not do that because they're not under the same regulatory environment that banks are, and they're not government chartered the way banks are. Yes, they have corporations, and they're granted limited liability, which is extremely important. Most of these corporations would be very different without it, which is a government protection. And so in that sense, the government's certainly entitled to regulate them for public purpose in exchange for that. But I'd say it's a whole order of magnitude different from the banking system.
Okay, and let me ask you,
excuse me, the government accepts bank deposits for payment of taxes. It does not accept liabilities from General Electric for payment of taxes.
Okay, that makes it clear. And I'd like to talk a little bit about the Federal Reserve, because we have all this talk of tapering. And what do you see as happening with the Federal Reserve into the next year? Are we going to have a tapering? What is the Federal Reserve going to do?
I think we are going to have tapering, because I think that they believe that it's responsible, potentially responsible for asset bubbles. So I think the reality is that we will have it. However, I think they're probably mistaken in most of their understanding the notion of quantitative easing itself.
Well, let me ask you about, there are $1.7 trillion in excess reserves that basically the Fed is paying 0.25% interest on. And yes, they're not causing price inflation or serious price inflation yet. But what if there's a crisis of confidence in the U.S. dollar? Is it possible that this could matter someday, even if it's not right now?
Okay, don't forget, when the Fed is printing reserve balances, right, that's how they pay for securities. At the same time, you can say they're unprinting the securities. So Treasury securities are nothing more than dollar balances in securities accounts at the Fed, and reserves are dollar balances in reserve accounts at the Fed. So when the Fed buys securities, all they're doing is debiting securities accounts, crediting reserve accounts. You have the exact same number of dollar balances at the Fed to the penny. So if you include Treasury securities under your definition of money, they are not printing any new money. They're unprinting one form and printing a different form. And that's exactly why we've seen absolutely no signs of QE when we look at any of the actual economic indicators. So number one, they're not printing money in a way that matters to anyone.
That was my interview with Warren Mosler, president of Valence Co. Inc. So let's turn to Perry Ann, who will be breaking down income inequality.